Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you today for this roundtable on animal legal personhood from the perspective of Asia, such an exciting and topical issue. I'm Marine Lercier, fellow for the Animals and Biodiversity Program of the Global Research Network think tank. I'm a predoctoral researcher and PhD student in animal law at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I'm accompanied by Rebecca Madrid, junior fellow for the program, who has been responsible for the organization of this roundtable. And she's broadcasting the event live on YouTube, which you will be able to watch again on the Global Research Network channel. For those of you who do not know it yet, I invite you to visit our website and our program page to learn more about our international network of academics. And in particular, I invite you to get in touch with our junior fellows if you wish to collaborate with us by becoming an associate member. Thank you all for being here today, and I thank our speakers for accepting our invitation, as well as our partners, ACTAsia and the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, for their help in organizing this event. We're very, very lucky to count on their support and expertise. We started this series on animal legal personhood with our very first junior fellow, Eva Bernett Kempers, whom I would also like to thank, starting from the observation that this proposal to change the legal status of animals was often discussed from the Anglo-Saxon perspective. We then started a journey around the world to explore the legal status of animals and to look at this solution, among others, and its implementation in practice at the regional level and in different jurisdictions with diverse legal systems, encouraging intellectual exchange and discussion. And this leads us today to invite 4 amazing women to discuss the legal status of animals in 4 Asian countries: India, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Japan, and to ask what those or could actually mean legal personhood for animals or certain animals in practice, and whether there are demands and intellectual foundations for it. So without further ado, let's open the floor for presentations. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to write your questions in the Zoom, the YouTube chat, as we will have a discussion at the end. Our speakers will be introduced by the co-founders of our partner organizations, ACTAsia and the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, Pei Su and Xiao Yu. Pei Su is a Chinese sociologist. She is the co-founder and CEO of ACTAsia, an international charity established in 2006. She is a strong advocate of education and training as the main vehicle for long-term sustainability, aiming to inspire people to understand and appreciate the world we share and to take responsibility for the protection and preservation of its inhabitants and resources. Pei, we would be delighted to hear a few words about ACTAsia before moving on to the first presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor to be here with many of you here. Like Mari has explained, ACTAsia is an international charity. We have a consultative status with the UN ECOSOC. Our program have been focused on driving for long-term sustainable change for animal, people, and environment. And all our programs are contributed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well. And this webinar particularly is very close to my heart because in my 30 years experience working with a charity in Asia for the movement, I have working with many countries in regards about the legal status of law, particularly in the countries like China, Taiwan, and Japan, and Singapore, Malaysia, and in India as well. And so in Japan. And so I think for me to now see many scholars and researchers like yourself, our speakers, they are focusing on the legal status is really important. And particularly this webinar is very close to, in linking with our ICARE, the Institute of Caring for Life for Education and Research. So this is what we really want to is provide, working with a global research network to provide this platform to allow more academics to help and to look into the animal issue, the link in terms of legal status. So this is a great honor to kick off as a star for this webinar. And so without the delay, I would like to use this opportunity to introduce our first great speaker is Padam Venkatraman from India. Padama is a practicing advocate based in New Delhi, India, and she has a deep interest in of human, animal, and environment rights, and related to the consequence for our collective future as advocacy for ethically sourced food is complicated by religious, caste, class conflicts, and injustice in India. She believes that empathetic dialogue with a vulnerable section of society is crucial for the future of the animal rights movement. Padam's current practice criminal law before the District Court and Delhi High Court. She has worked on a range of issues, including the legal detentions of prisoners and immigrants, procedural issues in a political motivation trial, and liability of corporate in white-collar crime. She also in the past examined non-compliance with West segregation laws, inadequate protection for sanitation workers in India, and the need of a stronger environmental impact assessment regime. So let's welcome Padama for her presentation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So since we have only 15 minutes and I've already been introduced, I'm going to get straight to our topic. So today I will be exploring whether India has legal personhood for animals. So we will be looking at 4 broad sections. So 1, does the Indian legal framework provide for legal personhood for animals? 2, how is legal personhood being discussed, if it is being discussed? And 3, is there a shift, if any, from a welfarist approach to a rights-based approach? And last, we will just look at a few challenges that might exist to legal personhood and the future of animal rights jurisprudence in India. So before we start, just a few points to keep in mind for those of us who are not too familiar with the Indian legal system. 1, we follow a common law system. 2, even today, regardless of advancements that we might be making towards a rights-based approach, we still follow a welfarist approach. It shapes the legal protections in our constitution, in our welfare legislations, and judicial precedent. Across movements and causes, India is slowly embracing contemporary rights jurisprudence, but it is simultaneously wrestling with these deep ties to culture and tradition. So courts, you will see, even in all these animal law cases, courts are still reaching back into Indian or Hindu culture, mythology, religion, right, in search of legitimacy for these animal rights. Finally, India is a deeply religious country even today, with strong ties to culture and tradition. Different religious communities have distinct relationships with animals. So even with a rights-based approach, it would be difficult to account for both the interests of animals and the interests of these different communities, because often giving legal weight to one set of interests can often be seen as a threat to another set. So with these points in mind, I asked the first question: does our legal framework provide for legal personhood for animals? So broadly, there would be 3 sources of law to look at in India: our constitution, enacted in 1950, our welfare legislations, and judicial precedent. So I'm going to start with the constitution. While it is a long, detailed document, only few sections are particularly relevant for animal rights advocates. One is of late, it has gained relevance for animal rights advocates. Those are the fundamental rights. So a particular chapter of our constitution deals with fundamental rights available to mostly citizens and in some cases non-citizens. These include the right to life, privacy, liberty, movement, trade, etc. Historically, they've only been available to human animals, but of late, from 2014, with a landmark judgment of the Supreme Court of India, it has tentatively been extended to a certain section of animals. And we will see that later. But to just remember at this point, fundamental rights are historically only available to humans. They are justiciable or enforceable, which means that I could technically go to the Supreme Court and claim legal remedies for their violation. There is another section in the Constitution which deals with fundamental duties. This includes my duty as an Indian to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to be compassionate to living creatures. So these fundamental duties, unlike fundamental rights, are not enforceable, which means I cannot claim any remedies for their violation. However, they do act or provide a lens to courts to understand or interpret legislative action, legislative intent, right? And they sort of reinforce a sense of social responsibility for Indians. They, however, even though they are not enforceable, they are always invoked because it is possibly the Magna Carta of animal law in the Indian Constitution. So the Constitution itself does not provide for legal personhood. So now we will look at whether welfare legislations have fared any better. So our main welfare legislation is anthropocentric in nature. It's called the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. It was enacted in 1960. It criminalizes certain forms of cruelty to animals, but it has these broad major exceptions with regard to animals in food, animals used for religious sacrifices and other purposes, and animals used in entertainment or performing animals. So you can see that it treats animals essentially as property. And over the years, while courts have tried to sort of improve or push the boundaries of animal welfare, the doctrine of necessity, has a strong hold over the act and the kind of welfare that is granted to animals, the kind of protections that are granted to animals. Importantly, you can also see these, classes of animals or a hierarchy of animals being created within this legislation. You have animals used in food and, for religious purposes and in entertainment at the very bottom. And you have wild animals, even in other legislations, occupy a higher status in Indian law. And one particular animal, which is the cow, occupies a very unique position in Indian law because of our there's a rich tradition and culture of worshipping the cow, and that has led to several conflicts between animal rights advocates and human rights advocates. These conflicts are perceived as inherent and essential conflicts and that they cannot be resolved, but we will explore how courts are looking at that conflict. So legal personhood cannot be found in these legislations as well. So then where exactly is legal personhood being discussed, if at all, in India? The only answer that we have is precedent, right? So for those of you who are not as familiar with the common law system, our structure of the legal system in this country is India is divided into several states. Each state has a lower court or a district court, several district courts for each district. Above that, you have a state high court, which is the first appellate forum. And above that, you have the Supreme Court of India, which is the final appellate forum, which also looks at several constitutional questions, right? So first, we'll get the big case out of the way. For those of you who might have followed, developments in the Indian legal system, you have the landmark case of 2014 called Animal Welfare Board of India versus A. Nagaraja. So the context for this case is quite complex. So I will only briefly touch upon it today. The Supreme Court basically banned Jallikattu, which is a sport involving the taming of bulls in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, on the ground that these bulls were entitled to protections under our welfare legislation, that is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. And in doing so, the Supreme Court read the 5 freedoms into the provisions of the Act, right? And the Supreme Court also analyzed how speciesism is prevalent even in Indian law. It set the gold standard as species best interests. It importantly extended the fundamental right to life, which was previously available only to human animals, to non-human animals as well. However, this right, which also includes the right to dignity, right to fair treatment, right to live in a healthy environment, and protection from unnecessary pain and suffering inflicted by humans, these rights are all subject to the law of the land. That is, they're all subject to the doctrine of necessity, which includes depriving the life of the animal out of human necessity. So while in international headlines, it might have read like Indian Supreme Court grants, fundamental right to life to animals. The reality is it's a bit more nuanced than that. It is a step away from the, previously welfarist approach, but we will look at the legacy post A. Nagaraja, and did that has the observations on the right to life being extended to animals, what effect has that had, if any, jurisprudentially, right? So post this judgment in 2014, there were several legal developments. They're too long to be included in these 15 minutes, but the effect of those legal developments was that the sport still continues today. So the relief actually granted by the Supreme Court in the end, that isn't as relevant as the observations on the right to life being extended to animals. So what is this judgment's legacy, right? I would say more than anything, it sort of put a foot in the door for legal personhood to be talked about in India, right? By introducing legal personhood language, references, terminology, and recognizing these international advancements in animal law, there was a certain degree of pressure for other courts to also recognize these basic animal rights and further push the door open. It signified a slow shift, moving away from the traditional welfarist approach to a more rights-based approach, at least in theory, even if not in practice. Right? So decisions post A. Nagaraja naturally rely on this Supreme Court decision as precedent for legal personhood reasoning, or for the five freedoms, or for the species best interest standard, right? So what it results in is it brings more nuance even within a welfarist approach. So post this judgment, there have been a few directions in which courts have, passed decisions or made observations about animals' rights. One is a few courts, and these have made international headlines as well, a few courts have been bold and attempted to make a direct case for legal personhood. So in cases where the court was dealing with, say, the illegal transport of cattle or the mistreatment of, animals used for labor purposes, aside from granting the actual relief sought, which was to put an end to the cruelty, the court also discussed what juristic persons are, juristic entities are, and then proceeded to declare the entire animal kingdom as legal persons or entities. Now, this includes, birds, animals, horses, even rivers, right? So we're going to come back to what challenges such a broad, sort of classification could have for practitioners and for animal rights advocates. But that is one direction in which courts seem to be going. Another direction is to not make a case for legal personhood directly, but to situate or recognize that animal rights exist even within our welfare legislation, within the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Right? So while addressing possible reliefs for, say, illegal cockfights or illegal dog breeding, right, high courts are recognizing that animals have this intrinsic worth, this intrinsic value, and that basic rights to live in a healthy or clean atmosphere, protection from unnecessary pain and suffering, that these are all actually already guaranteed under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So this is a remarkable shift from pre-2014, because it is primarily a welfare legislation. So now they are reading our fundamental duty to protect the environment, which is the only source of animal law in the Constitution. They're reading this along with the observations made in A. Nagaraja about the right to life, and saying that these rights already exist within our welfarist legislation. So even when they're not discussing legal personhood, courts have started recognizing the five freedoms, a basic right to respect the dignity of animals, the right to food, the right to privacy, the right to movement, etc. And more than the rights-based language, other language used in some of these decisions is more indicative of a shift in vocabulary away from a welfarist approach, right? For example, courts are engaging with the individual needs, personality, and intelligence of these non-human animals concerned while considering their best interests. Non-human animals are no longer being abstracted because of legal jargon, but they're being written about as this living, breathing being who have important needs and desires. And courts are starting to recognize that in writing. So, for example, the Madras High Court in 2020, which is a state in South India, while considering the case of Lalita, a female elephant who was being used in religious functions, they wrote of elephants being sensitive, possessing self-awareness, that they could feel the same emotions humans are capable of. Now, while these are scientific observations as well, the court also described Lalita as happy, healthy, exhibiting friendliness, having dignity. They spoke of her best interests. They spoke of possible psychological wounds if the reliefs weren't given, right? So in another case, the Delhi High Court, while addressing the right of community dogs or stray dogs to food, they wrote, Indian dogs are cheerful souls, enjoy being around people. They're an alert breed. They tend to be cautious. They're intelligent. They become bored if training sessions are repetitive in nature. So the language that courts are using to engage with the personality and the character of the non-human animals, I would say, signifies the shift more than the rights-based language, because sometimes the rights-based language is largely, as we will see, in the observation part of the judgment, that is the obiter dicta. The references to the actual character of the animal are normally made in relation to the 5 freedoms and how those are met for the animal. So they're closer to the actual relief sought in the petition. So I would say some of that language which courts use to engage with the character of the animal and the immediate circumstances and needs of the animal, those might be more indicative of our shift away from a welfarist approach, right? So how are these discussions around legal personhood being triggered? Because not all of these are in major constitutional challenges or constitutional debates in the country. In most of these cases, legal personhood is not even sought as a relief and may not even be an issue, right? They're happening in cruelty-based or wildlife cases. So judges seem to be pushing the welfarist approach, pushing the boundaries of it, and centering their remedies under these welfare legislations. But they're centering them after having discussions about sentience, after having discussions about the 5 freedoms and the dignity of the animal concerned, right? So there is good progress being made in that Indian courts do seem to be more willing to engage with animal rights and modern rights jurisprudence. More importantly, in Nagaraj, what it became famous for is that it extended the fundamental right to life, that is Article 21 of our Constitution, to non-human animals. But I would say its legacy is that it gave courts and future judges a vocabulary or a language to explore a framework for animal rights that works in India, and that it helps them push the boundaries of these welfare legislations and constitutional jurisprudence on animals. Now, this can help obtain better remedies in the short term, not in the long run, because finally there is a gap in the animal rights framework, in the legal framework, which is why judges often do not. They're sort of reaching into either religion or Western rights jurisprudence, or conflating welfarist and rights-based jurisprudence in an attempt to develop a better framework for animals and give better remedies. So this is, I would say, a short-term benefit that we are reaping the fruits of until the legislators kick into action. And a few challenges that I would say that we need to focus on in the coming years is that, one, I think the legacy of some of these decisions is that this legal personhood debate has become a little overbroad, right? So you have legal personhood being granted to rivers, to horses, to the avian kingdom. This could lead to a few issues, right? One is when you look at a judgment like this, it's difficult sometimes for practitioners and activists alike to understand the binding aspect of these judgments. The bulk of the discussion about legal personhood might end up being obiter dicta, and it's difficult to sometimes use it convincingly in another case. A second challenge might be, how would you implement this legal personhood, these observations in practice, right? What does it actually mean to say that a river and say a dog have legal personhood in the absence of any guidelines subsequent thereto? There is no clarity on what this direction means in practice. Some decisions are even holding that legal personhood, that XYZ are legal persons with rights and corresponding duties and liabilities. Now, for non-human animals, does that make sense? What would that mean? There is no clarity on these things because judgments are ending and making these sort of sweeping observations when declaring animals as legal persons. Finally, there is also a lack of clarity on the source of these animal rights, right? There's a need for constitutional clarity because sometimes courts are saying that our fundamental duty as humans to protect the environment is conferring a corresponding right on the animal, that is the right to live. So that might lead to a strange situation ethically where their rights are sort of contingent on us implementing our duty. Another is that courts are referring to Hindu religion, culture for how we should treat animals and whether they should have rights. Throws up interesting questions as to should animal rights depend on any of these in the first place, right? So that brings me to my concluding sort of thought that I want to leave everyone with is, how are we developing modern Indian animal rights jurisprudence, right? Why are there different approaches to recognizing animal rights or legal personhood in the first place? Courts seem to be struggling with these gaps in the animal framework, and in an attempt to develop a rights framework judicially, they seem to be trying to marry Indian law, existing law, with these references to Hindu religion and culture with Western rights jurisprudence on legal personhood. One advantage to locating rights within Hindu culture could be that certain sections of society might find these decisions more agreeable. For example, while granting legal personhood to the entire animal kingdom, courts have said that in Hindu mythology, every animal is associated with a god, and therefore they should have XYZ rights, right? But when activists across the world, social movements, and even courts are moving away from religious texts when fighting for the rights of disadvantaged human communities, do we want modern Indian animal rights jurisprudence to have any cultural or religious foundation at all? So if there is a conflict like this, so why are courts continuing to marry religion and culture with rights jurisprudence, right? One explanation could be it's a search for legitimacy for animal rights, right? Because there are no clear rights in the constitution or in legislations for them. Another explanation could be that courts are attempting to draw from this philosophy of compassion and culture that Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism has. And therefore, sometimes the Supreme Court has also held that this is fine. It's okay for courts to articulate this philosophy of compassion by reaching into history, that this is holistic analysis. So it's actually legitimized marrying religion and rights jurisprudence, right? But this approach could prove challenging, as we are seeing currently in India. For centuries, Brahminical Hindu vegetarianism, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it was devised to oppress lower castes, and it has been packaged or legitimized in the guise of animal welfare reforms aimed at protecting the cow only, not other animals, right? So contemporary animal activists today are struggling to distance themselves from this religion-backed animal welfare and center conversations around animal rights, the animal's interests, and not human conflict. So it might be time to reflect on how we want to frame our modern animal rights jurisprudence on personhood and the boundaries we want to draw between religion and law. I would suggest maybe a solution might be to explore that we want to align law with science and sentience and the animal's interests, right? Legal personhood and modern animal rights could be primarily based on sentience and the inherent rights and needs of animals to preserve that sentience, right? There might be a concern that science is not always neutral, but one step at a time. So with that, I think I've exceeded my 15 minutes and I'm sorry about that. But maybe we can continue any questions you have in the discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Parma, for your wonderful start of this presentation. I think you touch a really, really complex issue in such a short time. It's amazing. And I think, as a sociologist, my background, I cannot ignore the importance of the socio-political context when we talk about legal system and how this based on the today's science. About you talk about sentient being, where there is a science, it's not easy. But I'm so glad at least this issue has been started. There is always good there's a conflict. And with a conflict, then we have a breaking point to move forward. So thank you very much. And please do stay with us. I'm sure we will have lots of discussion later. And without due delay, I want to introduce Catherine. And Kat started Vietnam Animal Aid in 2013 with her US 501c3 nonprofit organization, Vietnam's first and only farm animal sanctuary and vegan rescue. In 2016, she opened the first nonprofit international clinic in Vietnam, which ran for several years before closing due to lack of funding. But the vet project will be reopening this year as a mobile vet clinic and anti-speciesist vet training program. Prior to her work in Vietnam, she started international relationship before leaving the USA in 2006 to live and travel abroad throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America. She has a master in disaster management focused on animals in disaster. Her work, rescue, vegan advocacy on the ground in Vietnam and Europe has given her the first hand understanding of the political, cultural, and economic context of animal rights in the global South. Over to you, Kat.
Yes. Anyway, that was so interesting, Padma. I'm so excited. I took a whole bunch of notes. I know it looks like I was talking on my phone, but I have so many things that I want to ask you in a minute. So please don't go anywhere. So as I have been introduced, of course, I'm obviously not from Vietnam, so this is going to be a slightly different sort of take on things. But this is about legal personhood for animals in Vietnam, and I really want to discuss kind of where we are now and where we can really go from here in this field. So this is my cat, Luna. I actually rescued her from the cat meat trade, interestingly enough, and she's insane and she pees on everything, but we love her anyway. So like we mentioned, so I've been in Vietnam for 10 years. I was out for 2 years during COVID, but I'm not a Vietnamese citizen. And so things are a little bit different the way that I see things. And of course, I was mentioning before we started that common law is my personal interaction with the law as an American, though I've lived there, I lived in the United States for about half my life at this point. I'm 43 now. So I've been living in civil law countries predominantly since then. But my background is in international politics from Washington, D.C., American University there, and I am a master of disaster, which makes a whole lot of sense because I run a rescue in Vietnam, which is a giant disaster. But so I'm not a lawyer, but I've had a lot of interesting experiences with the law, 9 years operating an international rescue would do it, and both a nonprofit American one and a Vietnamese for-profit company, which is the only way we could run a veterinary program. Why is it not? Anyway, yeah, but I've been gone for a while. I'm just going to skip through this. Who really cares about me? Here's the thing that's super important about this. And at first I was reluctant to sort of accept this invitation because I'm obviously not Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese have very little ability to speak about their country honestly while being in the country. And we'll get to that in a second, but it is a heavily censored country and most Vietnamese are reluctant to be honest and say it like it is. So the Vietnamese legal, economic, and political system is something that I've been drowning in for a little while and trying to get somewhere with. And I think it's something that people don't really understand much. We think about Vietnam as a place that was at war. We think about it as a place that has the dog meat trade, and that's about it. But there's 97 million people here. It's a very large economy. The average salary of $315 a month does not in any way explain what this country is because there's a massive wealth gap. Like I said, civil law tradition based on French civil law. It's also a former colony on Soviet socialist law. It is market-based socialism. So it's sort of like what I like to call socialist-ish, right? So it doesn't have essentially a planned economy. And this is really important when we're talking about agriculture and animals involved in that. But it's very market based and low to middle income country based on 50% services. It's moving away from agriculture. So it's moving away from animals and plant, of course, and agriculture and more into services and manufacturing. So that also has a lot to do with legal personhood in this country and the protections. So as you can see, this picture explains it all to me. It's a stock photo, but when I saw it, I thought this is Vietnam. There are a lot of political limitations for legal persons of any kind in this country. And that has a lot to do with whether we pursue legal personhood for animals or even the environment here. Let me move this out of the way. So it is an authoritarian single party system with the Communist Party of Vietnam as that single party, and then as a National Assembly, which is essentially the parliament. There are no free and fair elections. The Vietnamese will dispute that. But there's also no independent judiciary because it's a single party system. And so there's a lot of things that make it very difficult to protect any legal person. No freedom of expression or press. It is a highly censored regime. No freedom of association or peaceful assembly. So that means no protest. So the will of the people, regardless of how they feel about animals, is limited because of the way that they are able to interact with the government. There are definitely insufficient legal protections. That's not true. There's insufficient enforcement for on-paper legal protections for women, children, disabled, LGBTQ plus, and minority ethnic groups. And there's very limited protection for labor. And again, let me repeat that there is limited enforcement for on-paper protection of labor. Hang on, I've got to move you guys out of the way here. Okay, so rule of law is something that I think is really important if we're going to discuss anything about animals as persons. So Oxford says that it's a restriction of arbitrary exercise of power by subordinating it to well-defined and established laws. Well, I mean, these laws are very well established. They're very well defined, but they are by no means subordinate to the exercise of power by the Vietnamese government, which is essentially a mafia. It rules by fear, and it's deeply steeped in bureaucratic nonsense that can usually be subverted by favors and money in the right hands. Typical corruption, which puts us at 87% in the world. We are beating Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia, which they're very excited about, but that's not really a very high bar, far below Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. So legal persons, humans and corporations at this point lack these basic protections. Vietnam is Switzerland on paper, and it is the wild, wild west in practice. This is the part that is the most important when I talk about legal personhood. It is culturally non-confrontational. It emphasizes harmony, obedience, respect for authority, allegiance to family and community. It has Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism and ancestor worship as its sort of cultural basis, you know? So this, that makes so much sense when you understand the Vietnamese government and how it interacts with the culture. So this is my cat Marbles and my chicken Louise. She is the oldest chicken in Vietnam, we believe, at almost 10 years old. She is a goddess, and I would take a bullet for her. So the existing legislation for animals is really just as property, and that continues to be true throughout the world. This is not a Vietnamese problem by any means, and this is one that has been identified for many years. Thank you, Professor Gary Francione. When animals are property, they lack a lot of protection. So since I've been in Vietnam, I came in 2013, 2015, 2018, 2020, we have the animal husbandry laws and veterinary laws. These are all unfortunately focused on humans, essentially. So food safety, it's about humans. Talk about veterinary drug use, which is so poorly regulated. It's just a joke. I mean, like, I get ketamine in the mail. I've got on a tourist visa. Give me a break, guys, you know? So food safety, veterinary drug use, on all these laws, enforcement is lacking. Protection of economic activity. So livestock, rearing animals is an economic activity. So we have ag-gag laws in Vietnam. Waste disposal is an environmental problem. At least they've acknowledged that, but it's very poorly enforced. And then they say doggies need rabies vaccinations. Hooray. However, if you look at all of this existing legislation, if you replace the word livestock with sugarcane or rice, it's really the same document. Nothing has changed. Animals of any species are so far from being persons. They are just inanimate objects with no regard for their best interests as property of humans. They are economic units, and that goes for pets, that goes for wild animals, that goes for farmed animals. It doesn't matter, animals in circuses and zoos. So this is kind of a funny quote for me. Humanitarian treatment of livestock. Humanitarian, the word itself is actually only related to humans. Humane is the word they're looking for, but this is the law, and they translate it into English. This is for one of the recent ones in 2018. One of the most important ones up front was that must have cages or sheds suitable for livestock. So this is around about 20 minutes from my house, my animal shelter, the only farmed animal sanctuary in the history of Vietnam. And these are what they consider to be suitable sheds and cages for livestock at the pig market. They grab them by their feet and they pull them up, and it's not nice. They say, do not beat or ill-treat animals in raising them, transporting them, or slaughtering them. I think anybody could argue that this is ill treatment, and there was definitely beating going on when I was there. Don't let them see other animals before they're murdered, give them water before they're murdered, etc. This is my favorite quote. Humanitarian treatment of livestock must respect and be in harmony with traditional beliefs, religions, traditional cultures, and be accepted by the social community, right? So in Vietnam, we have a different sort of system of Buddhism here, which is where 2 times a month, full moon and the half moon, Buddhists here are usually vegan. So we have a ton of vegan restaurants that are all over this country. And this is actually where I went vegan 9 years ago. So this has Buddhism and veganism are inextricably connected in this country. So the humanitarian, I hate saying that, treatment of livestock really should be respecting that religion as well. But it doesn't seem to be. So the punishment for these in the criminal code and the civil code of 2015, most recently in the 29th article of this particular law, is the punishment for the violation of these is just fines. They just slap a little fine on them. And a lot of these are for the ones that are actually getting found out are the ones that are the corporate ones that, I mean, $150, $1,000 doesn't really mean anything for them. And I made it bounce by accident. I don't know why I did that. So we got to look at which species could become persons. And I think this is an argument that is being talked about around the world. This video is actually one that I took last month of chickens on the back of a motorbike. Again, talking about animals and humanitarian treatment in transport. So these were there was probably about 25 to 30 chickens on this motorbike, and this is quite common. And you can see that they're in the middle of Da Nang as well, which is a city of 1 million, flapping around, fighting for their lives as usual. So we look at what is interesting for the people of Vietnam and what has gotten media attention, even with the heavily censored media. So in 2015, there was a truck that came from China that was full of cats. A lot of them were dead. And the animal health department and the environmental police decided to bury them alive. Well, they crushed them with a bunch of dump trucks and then they buried them or whatever, which is commonly done by chickens if they do not have the appropriate done for chickens, excuse me, not by chickens. I don't think chickens would do that. But it's commonly done for other animals, but everybody gets their knickers in a twist because they're fluffy kitties. That got international and domestic attention. Most recently, 15 dogs and 1 cat were beaten to death and burned during COVID when the owners tested positive as a checkpoint coming from Ho Chi Minh City up. This month, I think this is quite funny, not funny, haha, but funny, what the fuck. 20 cats were poisoned outside of a steakhouse in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. And for some reason, the only attention was put on the fact that they were fluffy kitties, and the fact that the restaurant is a morgue was not apparently relevant. There is a pig slaughter festival that has been going on for many years in an area called Nam Cung, and it has been cited by the government as uncivilized. So this is kind of how the Vietnamese government looks at the laws related to animal treatment. Does it look uncivilized? And this will go back to dog meat in a minute, but talking about, for some reason, pig breeding, confinement, and killing 44 million animals wasn't really a problem. Chopping them in half with a machete, apparently a problem, but the 44 million others, not a problem. Bear bile, pangolins, rhino horn, endangered primates. So these are really kind of your wild animals and dogs essentially endangered animals, primates, typical for really any country. So this is a really important point. And I was watching Dr. Joe Wills from the University of Leicester recently. And when he said this phrase, social congruence, I jumped out of my seat and I was like, this is the phrase I've been looking for to discuss animal rights and legislation in Vietnam. And legal personhood specifically. Speaking of, this is Louise, and her friend India died, and she was mourning her there. She stood with her for a while after she had passed away before we buried her. She's very much a person. So the real question here, there's many questions. I have no answers. I have a lot of questions. One of the biggest questions is related to authoritarianism and legislation. Do we need society at large to agree with laws in order for them to be enforceable, right? And this is all about social congruence. I would say yes and no. Yeah, enforcement is a long way off for most protections for all kinds of legal persons, but we can still shift social norms that protect animals regardless of laws and rule of law. Do Vietnamese agree that animal cruelty is wrong? Yeah. Essentially, they do. The majority of Vietnamese are against certain kinds of animal cruelty, dog meat trade, bear bile, wildlife trade, but most of them still consume animals. This is true for every other country. And just because they're against animal cruelty doesn't mean that we would have social congruence if we had a legal personhood for animals, and then we had society not really believing that they should have personhood for dogs, bears, or pangolins that they otherwise would agree to protect. I mean, really, the question comes down to, can we enforce legislation in a country with the rule of law, but also an authoritarian government? This is a very strange system we have here. The point is that from property to legal persons in Vietnam, there's different consequences for different groups of animals. And we have to talk about the differences between them. There's different groups, the pets, the captive animals, that include circuses here, of course, and circuses and zoos. And then animals that are bred for research facilities, animals bred for food and clothing. That would include the crocodiles, which there's about, I think, 600,000 of them farmed. And then, of course, wild animals, many of which are endangered thanks to the wildlife trade. So the idea is going from property to legal person in Vietnam means that the interests of the individual animal have to be primary rather than secondary to human interests. And these interests must be represented by human guardians. Right? So it does need some sort of social congruence. But that goes the same for other certain types of humans, disabled ones. Those are not able to represent themselves in a court of law. Yeah, corporations, nature, etc. So the one thing that is really important to me in my work here is that I have figured out over these 10 years that welfare laws protect only human interests, never, ever animal interests. It's always about humans. And if we're going to have legal personhood, we need to change that. Can we make an extension of rights to all sentient beings? That's what we need for the future. I think of the civil code, which is how we make legislation in this country, how we make laws in this country. If the civil code were to give dogs or human-like animals like primates, or intelligent animals like elephants, I really hate that phrasing. But I do believe there is a potential to extend it to the animals that are only seen as economic units. But it's really unlikely, because the fact that the organizations, businesses, and politicians that are capable, there's just not any that are capable of and interested in fighting for the rights of farm species. And the corporate and the government interests in animal agriculture are too powerful. And again, this is the same old story everywhere. But interest in agriculture is decreasing. They're really trying to be a goods and services country. Giving personhood to status to animals also means that you got to acknowledge human rights a little bit more. Yeah, that's not actually going to happen at all under the current regime. And I'm allowed to say that because I'm an American. And if I were Vietnamese, I definitely couldn't say it. And I would also say that we really need to focus a lot more on social change for animals. Non-species is battle for social change for animals. I find that to be the best way to get to legal personhood for animals, if that were ever to be on the plate. So anyway, thank you so much. Contact me anytime.
So you will now introduce our next two speakers. Xiao is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute of Animal Law of Asia. He earned his LLM in Animal Law at Lewis and Clark Law School, and his LLM in Environmental Law and LLB degrees at Peking University Law School. His research interests cover law enforcement and legal culture, in comparative legal studies. He's now working in the areas of animal welfare protection law and wildlife conservation in Asian countries. Xiao, we would love to know more information about the Institute of Animal Law of Asia before we move on to the third presentation. If you would like to tell us a bit more, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Zihao. It's a great honor to be here. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Animal Law of Asia. IALA is a US-based organization established in 2020. We focused on the area of animal welfare, animal rights, and law and policy. We provide educational materials, news, and legal research articles, as well as online events on our website and social medias. Please follow us on social media and support our work if you have any interest in animal law in Asia. I will drop our website and the contact information in the box. Let me introduce the next speaker, Hira Jalil from Pakistan. Hira is a lawyer from Pakistan specializing in animal law. She holds an LM degree in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School, where she was a Fulbright Scholar and a recipient of Animal Law LM Leadership Award. She is also a recipient from the Global Ambassador Program, granted from the Center for Animal Law Studies. As part of her practice, she regularly advises clients on animal-related legal issues, including advising on the prosecution of animal abuse cases and assisting animal welfare nonprofits. Hira also litigates on behalf of animals and is currently litigating a case before the Honorable Lahore High Court against indiscriminate culling of stray dogs by the state authorities. She is also regularly appointed amicus curiae by the Lahore High Court in cases involving animal welfare. Additionally, Hira has drafted animal protection litigation for all 4 provinces of Pakistan, as has consulted with the OIE mission in Pakistan on draft animal health law. Let's welcome Hira Jalil from Pakistan, making her wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I just want to start off by thanking the Global Research Network, the Institute of Animal Law of Asia, and ACT Asia for organizing this very important roundtable. Throughout my time practicing animal law and studying animal law, I've always felt that voices from the Global South are missing in these very important animal legal conversations that obviously impact all the animals in the Global South as well. And so I'm very, very happy that events like these are being organized, which are more inclusive and kind of give a platform for people from the Global South as well. So just diving into the topic, I want to give a little background about Pakistan first. So Pakistan is a South Asian country. A lot of people mistake it for being in the Middle East. It's not, in fact, in the Middle East. It's in South Asia. It neighbors India, China, Afghanistan, and Iran. One of the kind of salient features to know about Pakistan is that it has a 97% Muslim population, and it is also an Islamic republic. So it is not a secular state, it is an Islamic state, which necessarily means that all laws that are made in Pakistan must conform with the injunctions of Islam. And there are constitutional courts that our constitution sets up, which have the power to strike down any laws which do not so conform with Islam. And so Islamic values, Islamic perception, and what is not allowed by Islam just greatly influence what happens to animals and certain animals in Pakistan, as I'll come to in a bit. But this is very, very important background. On the issue and listening to Padma's presentation, I felt like there was a lot of overlap with respect to what she said and about how animals are treated, or what the laws in India say about animals and Pakistani law, except I feel like India is a little bit farther ahead in terms of maybe even legislatively recognizing animals or constitutionally recognizing animal rights or welfare, so to speak. Pakistan doesn't go quite as far. So our constitution, for instance, is completely silent on the issue of animals period. So there's no mention of animal rights are far-fetched, but not even animal welfare or any kind of duties we have towards animals, or even the environment for that matter. Even our fundamental rights are very human-centric, and the definition of person in our constitution is also quite restrictive, as I'll explain in a bit. So in terms of constitutional, direct constitutional rights that one can derive for animals from the Pakistani constitution, there isn't really much there. But and in terms of the laws as well, they really reinforce the property status of animals. When you read the various laws that even criminalize animal abuse, for instance, to talk about prohibiting or killing or mutilating or rendering useless any animal which is above a certain value. So of course, then that means that animals are they're only deemed worthy of protection if they have a certain market value, so to speak, or are valuable to human beings. Similarly, our slaughter control laws prohibit the slaughtering of useful animals. This term here appears again in our slaughter control laws. And the useful animals are usually defined as animals, or largely defined as female animals, which are fit to breed, or other animals which are fit for draught purposes. So again, the rights or protections that are afforded to those animals are very much linked to the use they have to human beings. But I think most important to the question of personhood is that you cannot bring any action against a person who is abusing an animal that they legally own. So in terms of, I feel like, again, because personhood is such a broad topic, it's kind of sometimes it becomes really hard to think about what does it mean for an animal to be a legal person, and what rights or what privileges do persons enjoy that animals or non-persons don't enjoy. And I think one of those very kind of important privileges, as I will be talking about in greater detail, is obviously the right to enforce whatever right or whatever right is, or whatever interest is being violated that the law recognizes. And animals, because they are not legal persons, cannot enforce those rights that the law, as I will argue, does protect. So when we talk about animal rights, I interpret the term rights a bit differently. So I do think animals have statutory rights. Most anti-cruelty legislation does confer some sort of rights on animals, which would obviously then be in the most basic form, such as the laws found in Pakistan. The really our basic Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is a colonial era law, talks about not killing animals in unnecessarily cruel manner, or not inflicting unnecessary pain or suffering on them. So that kind of correspondingly gives rise to a right that the animal would have then to not be subjected to the unnecessary pain and suffering, or not to be subjected to being killed in an unnecessarily cruel manner. So I would argue that there are statutory rights that the law recognizes, but can animals enforce violation of these rights? And I think that is where the answer is an absolute no, because there is no legal provision, there's no constitutional provision that allows an animal to bring suit for to enforce any violation of their statutory rights. And the reason why there is, or the way you can kind of tell that there is no such legal provision, is because most legal provisions or most laws or the constitution, where it allows for someone to bring such suit, says that an aggrieved person or a person can usually bring an action or bring a suit or bring a writ petition before the court. And the term person is usually restrictively defined to exclude non-human animals, because it usually says a natural person and a body corporate. In our constitution, it's a person is a natural person, and the definition includes body politics and body corporate, but does not include animals or the environment for that matter. So in that sense, in the sense of enforcing any rights that the law gives to them, there really isn't much that supports non-human animals in Pakistani law. But then again, kind of like Padma highlighted is the case with India, even in Pakistan, it is the courts that have taken up this mantle to advance the cause of animal personhood or animal rights, and have either tangentially or very head-on tackled this subject, especially in recent years. So I'll just quickly talk about two of such cases. The first case I'll talk about is a Supreme Court of Pakistan decision in a case called Lal Khan Chandio versus the province of Sindh. The case related to the hunting of the Hobara bustard, which is a small bird, migratory bird that is hunted during that winters in Pakistan and is hunted by foreign dignitaries in certain provinces of Pakistan. And the Supreme Court of Pakistan is again the highest appellate forum in the country, and so this case made its way through the various lower forums, and essentially what was being challenged was the government's allowance of the hunting of the Hobara bustard, given that the Hobara bustard's numbers had been dropping over the years, and the IUCN had declared it was a vulnerable species. But the governments of certain provinces were looking to, in fact, take it, remove it from a protected status and move it into a game animal status, which would then allow hunting or even more hunting of the Hobara bustard than was currently taking place. And interestingly, the Supreme Court really invoked Islamic principles in this case and talked about how humans are the vicegerents of God on earth, and how under Islamic law, human beings have dominion, so to speak, over the environment and nature and animals. And so we therefore have that duty to protect them. And also, if we don't protect wild animals and we hunt them to extinction, then maybe there will be some future use that we could get out of that, or that our future generations could get out of them, that we would then be missing out on, because there would be none of those animals left to exploit, so to speak. And so that judgment, while it did have some really, really good parts as well, but from the perspective of animal legal personhood, or animals being considered on the same plane as humans under the law, it kind of really reinforced that hierarchy of animals being inferior to human beings in some sense, and therefore humans can, whatever we're doing, whatever privileges we allow animals to enjoy is out of the goodwill of our hearts, and it's not because the animals are on an equal plane to human beings legally, so to speak. However, later on, and in 2020, we see that in the case of Islamabad Wildlife Management Board versus the Metropolitan Corporation of Islamabad, the Islamabad High Court talked in a lot of detail about animal rights. This was the case that related to the shutting down of the Islamabad Zoo and relocation of animals from the zoo, including Kawan the elephant. And here, in this case, the Islamabad High Court talks about animal sentience, the various rights animals have, including the right to not be subjected to unnecessary pain and suffering, the rights of animals to live in an environment that meets their behavioral, social, psychological needs, the right to not be treated in a manner that subjects the animal to unnecessary pain and suffering, the right to be respected. And so the Islamabad High Court then talks in a great detail about how all of these rights are natural rights of animals, which is encouraging, because natural rights has historically been something that's been associated with human beings, divine rights or natural rights, or rights that we have by way of being human, by virtue of being human. And so the Islamabad High Court kind of talks a bit more about that concept, but in the context of animals, that animals have certain rights as well by virtue of being living sentient beings. So that's a very encouraging development. And then the Islamabad High Court here as well uses the right to life that's been enshrined in our constitution as being violated when animals are treated cruelly or neglected. The right to life, just to be very clear, does not strictly textual interpretation of the right to life does not lend any support for animal rights. But the Islamabad High Court probably felt comfortable going as far as to extend the right to life to animals, because historically in Pakistan, the right to life has been used to extend a number of rights to human beings, even that they don't necessarily have under the constitution, environmental rights being one of those. So all our environmental jurisprudence comes from the Article 9 right to life. And so it was just a logical, I would say, step further to say, okay, if this one article of the constitution has been interpreted so broadly, it makes sense to also include the right to life of animals within this right to life. So while again, this question does not tackle, this case did not tackle that that question of, can animals sue themselves? Can animals bring suit to enforce these natural rights that the court now has recognized that animals have, possibly even under the Constitution? It didn't tackle that question at all. But we see that post the Kawan case, steps have been taken in subsequent litigation to agitate this question. So for instance, there's this case that's currently pending in the Lahore High Court, titled Sunita Gulzar versus the province of Punjab, which challenges the practice of keeping exotic pets. However, in the admitting note of this petition, when the High Court admitted this petition, the High Court noted that, well, our Constitution says that a petition in the High Court can only be filed by an aggrieved person. So we'd be interested to know, could an exotic pet bring suit if they were being mistreated by their owner? And so could an aggrieved person, the definition of an aggrieved person, be extended to non-human animals? So this is a very interesting case. It's the first time a court in Pakistan, at least, is taking up a legal personhood issue like this, and also kind of its own accord, because this was not one of the grounds that was agitated by the petitioner. And so if this case, if the case does decide anything on this point, it would be the first of its kind to decide the question of animal legal personhood in Pakistan. Another interesting area that I personally would be interested to see how it plays out in Pakistan would be, unlike in, for instance, the US, where we see that habeas petitions, or in some Latin American countries, I believe as well, habeas petitions have been filed on behalf of animals to relocate them from confinement to sanctuaries. There has been no such case in Pakistan to relocate a zoo animal, for instance, to a sanctuary through a habeas writ. And I would be interested to see how that plays out in court, because our courts generally take a more expansive approach to this issue, as I will shortly discuss. But just before I get to that, I just want to quickly touch upon the fact that, personally, I think Islamic arguments for animal personhood would be very necessary and would be essential to afford any kind of legal personhood to animals. And I do think there are good sources of Islamic law that can be used for this purpose. There are a number of, Quranic verses. Quran is the Islamic scripture, and ahadith, which are sayings of the Prophet, which are the secondary source of Islamic, or one of the primary sources, in fact, of Islamic law, that indicate that animals may, in fact, be equal to and not inferior to human beings. For instance, there's a verse in the Quran that says, there is not an animal that lives on the earth, nor a being that flies on its wings, but they form communities like you. Hence, implying that it's not that humans are put on a pedestal over animals, and animals are then inferior to human beings, but implying that animals are communities and they live in societies just like us. And so just like we are a species of animal, there are also other species of animals that are not necessarily any less than or deserve less legal protection than us as human beings. But when we talk about legal, and now circling back to my point about what happens if legal personhood is granted to animals, and by legal personhood, I mean tomorrow there's a law that's passed in Pakistan that says animals can now bring suit personally. If a dog is being abused by its owner, it can, his or her owner, the dog can bring suit against the owner to enforce its right to not be subjected to cruel treatment. I'm not sure how useful that will be in the context of constitutional courts, which are our high courts or Supreme Court, especially especially because, for instance, in jurisdictions like the United States, a lot of these kind of cases get thrown out on standing, because one of the elements of standing is that you need to show that the plaintiff has been personally injured. You have to establish injury. But in Pakistan, like I mentioned earlier, our courts take a very lax approach to who can bring constitutional cases. The usual standard is public interest, that the subject matter of the case has to have something to do with public interest. And the test there is a fundamental right that's guaranteed by the Constitution being violated. And again, circling back again to the Article 9 and the right to life, because it has been interpreted so broadly, it's usually very, very easy to establish that, yeah, at least the right to life is being violated in some way or the other if an animal is being mistreated, or if an animal is being abused, or if there's a larger animal welfare issue. And you don't necessarily have to show that the person bringing the petition has suffered a personal harm or a personal injury. So the limitations to that approach, obviously, is that you still need to peg the animal issue to a human being's fundamental right to life, movement, property, something or the other. But I'm just practically speaking, it's a lot easier to bring these cases to court, to have them heard, and to even have them decided favorably in the favor of animals than they are in other countries where standing then becomes an issue there. However, the greater advantage of conferring animal legal personhood in a country like Pakistan, I believe, is where you're bringing, again, where you're talking about private properties and not government. So usually writ petitions and your constitutional courts can only be approached when the government is either doing something that they should be doing, that they should not be doing under the law, or that they are not doing something which the law mandates that they do. So broadly speaking, you can only file a constitutional case against a government agency. But in a case where I'm abusing my dog cannot bring an action against me, neither can anyone else, because that's not a constitutional issue as such. And so personhood, I feel like in a country like Pakistan could really be helpful in that sense, because it would allow animals or NGOs or interested people to bring action on behalf of animals before the courts, because the animals themselves will have the right to sue, because their legal rights will be recognized, and the right to sue and the right to bring suit will be recognized as well. And tangentially, it could also help in other ways. In Pakistan, for instance, animals cannot currently be beneficiaries of trust. You cannot will anything to an animal. Personhood could potentially change that, but again, it's because Pakistan is an Islamic country, we'd have to see how much Islamic law allows for something like that to happen. And of course, the third advantage that I see to conferring personhood status to animals would be that it could symbolically, obviously, really elevate the status of animals. Even if nothing comes out of it in practice, as we saw in the Kawan case, it's not like animals then were suddenly given all the rights the next day. There are still lots of abuses and sadly lots of mistreatment and exploitation that animals still have to face at the hands of human beings. But it did open the gates to a larger conversation around the issue of animal welfare or rights, animals, how they fit into our society, what we owe them, what they, and also just opened the gates for a lot of really good litigation in this area. And so just to conclude, I'm sorry if I went over time, but just to conclude, I would like to reiterate something that Padma mentioned during her talk, which is, I think, also very relevant to Pakistan, is that most of the effort being taken in this area, whether you talk about personhood or animal welfare or advancement of animal rights, is being taken by the courts, and we see legislation is really lacking behind. So our laws are from the colonial era, they're from the 19th century, but the courts in 2020, 2021, 2022 are passing all of these amazing judgments that really protect animals. But because there's such a divergent path being taken, it'd be interesting to see how far you could successfully stretch existing laws to fit into, to kind of allow for the protection of more and more animal interests, because it has to reach a limit at some point. At some point, maybe the constitution or the legal framework cannot possibly be stretched. The interpretation cannot possibly get any more liberal than that, and then you really need the law to change or the law to be amended. And then when we talk about the law being amended, we also have to think about the fact that Islam would play a great role. Islamic law would play a great role in any animal welfare law, because while, again, there are sources of Islamic law that lend support to animal protection, animal rights, animal personhood, it is, again, true that you can still slaughter animals, consume them for food, ritual slaughter. All of these are aspects of Islamic law that are part and parcel of those other, that also come along with those other really, really good stuff that Islam says about animals. There's also stuff that is problematic, but potentially for animal protection. So it'd be interesting to see how any new legislation or any personhood or any case that tackles personhood addresses those issues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hira, for giving us a wonderful speech.
Start the Q&A session. And first of all, since Moya, you were the last one, I would like you to ask my question while the audience may prepare their questions. You can either drop your questions in the chat box or ask the questions directly. My question is, you've mentioned that fish is excluded from the legal protection, and it basically states that there is the concept of IGO for people those who have a certain bond with an animal. And I wonder, what do you think about, for example, golden fish that many people keep as their pets? Can they be actually classified as those animals with whom humans can create their bonds?
Thank you for interesting questions. So you are right that there are many Japanese people who keep a golden fish as pets. And yeah, well, so today I didn't have much time to explain the whole picture of the Japanese animal protection law, but I mainly talked about the definition of protected animals in animal cruelty provisions. But actually in the law, the Article 1 states that people shouldn't abuse animals, and those sentences does not have the word "aigo," the limitation of "aigo" animals. So this applies to maybe fish, or it can be insects too. I mean, theoretically. So people try to avoid being cruel to animals, including fish or other kinds of animals, but only to aigo animals that can be punishable. Am I being clear? So yeah, the act is trying to say that animals are protected generally because they have lives, not because they are sentient beings. Because they have lives, so they are protected. But yeah, there are some limitations for some penalty or those punishment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was clear enough. Thank you so much. Pei, do you want to ask yourself?
Yes.
Okay.
I have involved in 1999 legislation amendments, working with a lot of groups at the time, working with the lawyers, and then to 2005. So I fully understand what you mean from aigo, because at the time we were arguing from the international level, aigo really is just people's love to animals. And so it's quite selective love, like you're saying, it's the only type of animal you love. So laboratory animal and other farm animals, they are not. So that was a fundamental issue. So from that, and I see probably are still there's an improvement, but still quite limited to date. So and also I remember the purpose of law at the time was arguing is not because for the human welfare and the benefit of society. At the time we were arguing the aigo, the law should really protect animal itself. This is very fundamental problem in many Asian countries when they are talking about legal personhood. The law itself, the act is for protect humans. It's not to protect the animals. So I think because of this background, my question to you is how much really the legal system or legal expert, particularly in Parliament, their understanding of animal science. I think Padma, you mentioned about animal sentience and the understanding of sentience as a being themselves. And this is a being issue. The status being recognized in Australia and New Zealand in constitution, and how you see this in Japan, particularly, like I said, the parliaments and the legal court judges. That's my question.
Judges. So actually, there are not much arguments in the court. Well, Japan is a civil law country, and many cases are discussed before the court. I mean, so even in civil law issues, they discuss with ADL, not like cases that not in the trial, but people try to talk privately, and those discussions are not published, and not many cases are in criminal law cases too, because Japanese officials try to deal with animal cruelty issues before cruelty is getting serious. Of course, some are, but they don't, because we don't have whereas IGO in constitutional law, so we don't have any discussions in constitution court, and yeah. Well,
I think my question probably a bit shorter is, do you see the laws now from the IGO, this angle is really for protect animals or treat them as a being, or rather still see the law itself is for the benefit for the human society and the care for the humans?
I think care for humans. My simple question is, but some people try to, elevate animals' legal status or ethical status using the words IGO sometimes, because it's closer to general people's understanding and to their heart. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I understand.
Thank you so much, Pei, for your question. I was wondering, given the cultural background in Japan, and obviously Japan is not the only conservative country in the world, and of course there are limitations and restrictions in each country, but I think most of them are in Asian countries. And obviously Western methods of animal protection will not be appropriate in specific Asian countries. I was wondering, what do you think is the most effective approach to take, or maybe the first step to legal personhood for animals in Japan?
Yeah, I think the first step can be that, if there are more and more legal scholars who can analyze and evaluate about animal rights, and if they can introduce Japanese version of animal rights, then I think it will be powerful, but it's not happening yet. We are still talking about IGO to welfare, so it's pretty far from there.
Thank you. I agree with you. Probably education would be one of the most effective maybe tools to start in any country. And while we're asking questions, there is one from the attendees, and it's for you as well, so I will just read it. You mentioned that there is a lack of understanding with regard to animal sentience. However, it is common to see animals being addressed as individuals with likes and dislikes in popular television programs or in the zoo and aquariums in general. Could you please tell us more about the difference between this Japanese understanding of sentience and the discourse of animal sentience originated from the West?
Japanese understanding of sentience. So the thing is, I think many Japanese people takes a relational approach, as I kind of mentioned in my talk, and it is not difficult. It is not easy for Japanese people to view animals as, yeah. Okay, let me think about it. Maybe
it can help. I work with Japan many years, and like I said about involved law, I think the animal sentience, and the development of the sentience study, particularly in the West today, I think is still quite alien for many, scholars even, or legal system or authority in terms of seeing them as a being. So I think we are still far away from the ideal and the reality. The reality is seeing animals have a welfare. That is probably the first steps to understand the 5 freedom, the welfare as a free of suffering, free of, to be able to express a behavior. I think all these needs will need to be understood in a way, and along the way to educate understanding the sentient beings concepts. I think it's, if you look at the legal system within Japan and about IGO, you can see there's still very, very, in a way, is like Lou has said, is very conservative.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you so much,
actually,
Jane.
and actually,
Japan is not on its own. It's not.
Yeah. And it is interesting because general public do not think about sentience of animals and stuff, but those people who relate to animals daily, for instance, like zookeepers or sometimes farmers, some people in those situations started to think about animal welfare because of external pressure, and also, especially external pressure. But they feel more responsibility to improve animal welfare. So I think it's kind of changing little by little.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, would I be able to ask a question to Pakistan? I think what really, following what we discussed in Japan, in Pakistan, because of Islamic teaching and the taboo with the dogs, how does that deal with when you talk about personhood, the legal system, or even in the discourse itself?
Yeah, so I think that's a very pertinent question, and it's something that animal activists have been struggling with a lot in Pakistan, because dog culling is a really big issue. A lot of street dogs get very barbarically poisoned or shot, and people generally are not in favor of keeping them as companion animals or pets because they're considered unclean. And you're absolutely right in that Islam has something to do with it, but I think it's more of a cultural thing more than a purely Islamic thing. And I say this because when I was teaching animal law last semester, I really dived into this issue of what does Islam actually say about dogs. And you'll kind of see that in the kind of primary sources of Islamic law, which are the Quran and the Hadith, the Quran actually talks very favorably about dogs. The Quran allows you to, keep dogs for hunting, for guarding your house. You can eat game animals that dogs have hunted for you. And the only kind of prescription maybe contained in the scripture is that if a dog licks your bowl, you should just wash it 7 times, hence implying, scholars have interpreted that to mean that the dog's saliva is considered unclean, but not that the dog as an animal is considered unclean. And also there's like a story of these companions of these really holy men who fell asleep in a cave for many thousands of years, and a dog was their companion, and the dog fell asleep with them, and then God kind of woke them up after a few thousands of years, and they were really starting to discover that everything has changed. And this is also a story that's mentioned in the Quran, including the fact that the dog was the companion of those men. And so then you would kind of infer from that dogs actually do have a favorable status in the Quran. In the ahadith, maybe not so much. There are conflicting ahadith sayings of the Prophet, and that's where the confusion kind of comes from. But because certain myths are strong or certain taboos are stronger than others, it has now become a thing in especially Pakistan to consider dogs very unclean, or to consider it okay to kill them. Just even if they are unclean, that doesn't necessarily mean that you kill them, but that's kind of the way it's now treated here. And and counteracting those prejudices are definitely really important. But I do think there is room in the religion for that to happen, because I think that's the thing with religion. You can interpret it either which way, and you usually find support for whatever interpretation you do want to give to it, usually more often than not, to a scripture or a hadith or a source or a text. And so more kind of alternate interpretations of the dog issue from Islamic scholars, maybe, or from people who study Islamic law, would probably kind of really help in moving that conversation in a more friendly direction.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question and for this detailed answer. And I see Maureen has been raising her hand to ask a question.
Yes,
Maureen?
thank you. Yeah. I would have a question, for common law speakers regarding the approach taken by the courts. How would you compare with the habeas corpus litigations in the United States by the Non-Human Rights Project in particular, and in Latin America? Regarding the rights of nature, for example, how would you compare the different strategies and the different foundations, if you're familiar with the different strategies and litigations, of course?
If I could go first, I just had one point to make. There was one habeas corpus case in our country as well, with an elephant, Lakshmi, and the Non-Human Rights Project also had sort of engaged with this petition, I think, when they were preparing to file or assist in filing another habeas corpus petition in India. So that was anyway denied, but in India. But I think the takeaway for us is one, every case that raises any question or issue of legal personhood, whether it's, the relief sought is allowed or not. But like I said, I think it just pushes the door more open. It makes the issue more visible. However, like Hira had said earlier, I think one big challenge that at least the United States faces is standing, and at least in animal law cases over the past few years, several courts, while discussing either legal personhood or even animal rights in India, have declared either citizens of a state in loco parentis, that is, in parents, and who can sort of bring animal law cases on behalf of animals to courts, or courts themselves have gone beyond the relief sought in the petition and decided suo motu to take on additional issues and consider whether legal personhood ought to be granted or not, and parents patriae and stuff like that. So you see courts being almost generous in terms of locus, and that's because we also have sort of a rich history of public interest litigation, like Hira had pointed out. So I think that's common to India and Pakistan. And I think that that's one challenge when it comes to even, say, habeas corpus petitions. The court might not throw out the petition. They may refuse to grant relief on the ground that maybe the animal is not a legal person, but they'll maybe at least hear it, so it doesn't go out on at a threshold stage. So I think that itself, regardless of whether the reasoning is favorable or not, being able to argue and bring your arguments out in writing before a constitutional court, or before any court for that matter in India, it sets that sort of argument in the narrative that you want to start sort of pushing out into the mainstream. It brings it out in paper, it brings it out in the media, it gives other animal scholars something to talk about and build on. So I think that is one advantage that we do have, even if our context is entirely different from the West.
Thank you, Padma. I would like to ask a question. There are probably a lot of mistaken beliefs about Islam and Islamic countries. So I'd like to ask Hira, do you think religion might be one of the serious obstacles to grant legal personhood for animals in general, or maybe to specific categories of animals? And if the answer to this question is yes, what do you think would be the most effective means maybe to initiate the process?
I think for sure, it can be a hurdle. I wouldn't say for all animals, but definitely for specific categories of animals, especially farmed animals. Because again, the Islamic scriptures, or some sources of Islam are pretty clear about the fact that you can eat animals and you can slaughter animals for food, and those are the less disputed areas of Islam where there's less room for interpretation, or even though people have argued, so there are more eco-feminist or vegan Islamic perspectives as well, that argue that the way factory farming animals are now factory farmed, there's no room for that in Islam. Islam doesn't envision it. So it's not like there aren't any alternative arguments, but considering that it is something that the religion allows, personhood, because personhood, the way I see it, would kind of guarantee some minimum rights that you would then make it difficult to kind of engage in these practices. But I also find it very, very difficult in a country like Pakistan, which is constitutionally an Islamic state, and where the role of Islam over the past few years has in the role of religion in lawmaking, in all areas really of government, has just gotten stronger instead of weaker. So it's not even like you can see the country moving towards a more secular perspective. It's actually the other way around. And so I think that it's very important to engage with Islamic kind of arguments. And it's while I would ideally not want to engage at all, and I think it would be very nice to argue these questions from a very secular perspective and just on the basis of animal sentience and the fact that they feel and all of that. But considering the reality and the context within which we are working, it's important. If you disengage yourself from the conversation, then what you have to say will just not be taken into account, because the Islamic teachings that are more orthodox or less favorable to animals will probably win, because you wouldn't even present a counter argument. So I think that limited room as there is for certain species of animals to get personhood within the religion, I do think it is a long shot, but it can happen. But we need to stay involved in the conversation.
So basically, involving religious aspects in your arguments, you're saying it would be kind of beneficial, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That sounds great.
Can I actually say, I think that actually makes a whole lot of sense in Vietnam as well. I mean, I think what's different from us in Southeast Asia, as far as a Buddhist country, a very secular Buddhist country, is that our Buddhism, unlike Cambodia and Thailand, really is so connected to veganism and to compassion towards animals, and the fact that we've got the full moon and the half moon. I think listening to the arguments about Islam and its connection to animal rights in Pakistan really sort of struck something with me. Unfortunately, the thing about Buddhism is that they're not the most strong activists in general. I think kind of the nature of Buddhism is to kind of sit back a lot. And so they're not a really strong voice in terms of talking about animal rights. But I think it makes a whole lot of sense listening to that. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in. We have an advantage over the rest of Southeast Asia in that regard.
Thank you, Kat, for your insight. Pei, I see you have a question for Padma. Do you want to go ahead and just ask?
Oh, yes, sorry. I was just asking, the India legislation and legal system seems to have a bit more understanding or touch more about the animal sentience or animal personhood. Among other Asian countries, do you think that's the case? Listen to what others have shared here.
We might be a few steps ahead, but I feel like because of the population and the size of the population and the diversity of the population, the different demographics. We're dealing with different concerns posed by different sections of society belonging to different religions, different income brackets, right? So I think that is going to prove one of the bigger challenges to any progress in the animal rights movement. So I frankly think, despite many cases dealing with animal rights or legal personhood in India, we are a long way off from animals actually being declared in practice as legal persons. On paper, several protections might exist for Indian citizens, and it doesn't look very great, in reality when you are in India. So if you can see that the strength of the protections that are being given out by courts, this fancy language about fundamental rights, universal human rights, like Catherine spoke earlier, rule of law, it has to be enforced. There's no point really if it's on paper and it's not being enforced. So we are facing a problem there, definitely. So if human rights themselves that have existed since the Constitution and before, if they themselves, we can't guarantee those to vulnerable humans in India, then you can just think that despite what courts might say about sentience, we are a long way away from that. But knowledge is knowledge, and language and vocabulary is very important. And I would say that it forms an important, sort of foundation for the future. But I do think, and the last part of my talk, I'd sort of highlighted this perceived conflict between, religion and law, and especially rights-based jurisprudence. I think that will be one of the next big challenges that we will need to face, especially since a lot of the rights jurisprudence now is being supported by references to Hindu mythology or Hindu culture. But a lot of the conflicts with regard to diets and how animals are treated often arise when seen, in context of the oppression by upper caste Hindus of lower caste Hindus, or between Hindus and Muslims, communal violence. So none of these protections on paper mean much without resolving those other problems that are a barrier, that sort of are hindrances to the progress of the animal rights movement. Because as several of have very insightfully pointed out here on this platform today, there are several animals that do not have any protections under even laws in India. And those probably constitute the majority of individuals, right, suffering. So legal personhood, we are talking about maybe for like an elephant or one elephant, or, several chimpanzees, or maybe a few dogs. But like Moy had also had pointed out, there is a relational approach, I think, almost in every country, where even Indians can empathize to an extent with certain classes of animals. So I think that while my presentation, because I went through many judgments, might have given the impression that we are much better off than other countries, I would say that is, as a practitioner, I can say even criminal law, we're stuck with property-based associations even for humans, right? So for animals, it's going to take a long time now to come out of that, even if we speak jurisprudentially differently about them. Sorry if I seem a bit skeptical, but I think that the language that we're using is good. It's a start, but it's going to take a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Padma. I was wondering, you mentioned in your talk about, you talked about 5 freedoms. I was wondering if these 5 freedoms are enshrined in Indian laws or Indian codes. And if, for example, the animal organization would like to file a case against another organization or entity to grant legal personhood for animals, it might be right to freedom or right to life or something like that. What do you think would be the the effective sources to rely on in the court, because as far as I understand, although the Constitution of India provides mentions animals, it doesn't give the legal obligation to protect them. So I wanted to ask what will be the most effective sources to use in the court.
So I think the first part of your question was how would you go about sort of asking for the 5 freedoms in a court, or asking for them to be enforced?
I was asking if they're enshrined in any laws or...
No. So,
Okay.
I mean, not in text. So neither the Constitution nor the welfare legislations, it's not written into the provisions, but there is enough law now, like precedent, for me to say file a petition under the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act or under the Wildlife Protection Act, and say now that it is read into the provisions. So there is enough precedent now to support that, and I think courts would be pretty willing to recognize that without much challenge, right? But I think that normally we would now read, and the latter part of your question, I think, was constitutionally there is no, animals do not have any rights per se, but there is a fundamental duty, which I said is not really enforceable, but courts are now reading that fundamental duty to confer, these corresponding rights on animals, and reading the 5 freedoms as those rights, those basic rights that animals have, right? So I think practitioners are probably and are going to court with sort of a combination of that, where you're reading our fundamental duty as Indians to protect the environment and to have compassion for living creatures, reading that with the 5 freedoms that comes from precedent, and sort of locating that and using that to expand our welfare legislations. So we're reading our constitutional duty with the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act provisions, the protections that are already there, and sort of expanding the available protections for animals. That's what I said, that courts are sort of struggling with, creating a good animal rights framework that is an improvement from what we had earlier. So it's a combination of stuff that they're working with, because we do not have a law that puts all this down in one place in writing.
Thank you so much for this very informative answer. Because we're quite running out of time, I will ask the last question, and it's directed to Kat. Does the pandemic change the public's view towards animals? And do you think the zoonotic disease might be a chance to change people's lifestyles?
Why isn't it working? Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I mean, I think initially the response to the pandemic was actually quite bad for animals, and not, there was the rumor that they were, dogs and cats were potentially carriers of the virus and whatever. So people were abandoning them, they were killing them. There was a lot of this going on. But towards the end, when they started to have lockdown, so I mean, Vietnam did quite well during the pandemic for a while. And once they kind of got over the whole thing, I mean, they lived in their little bubble and they kind of had a pretty normal life for 2 years, which most of the world can't really identify with. But once the lockdown started to happen, when COVID came, things got a little bit different, because then people were being taken away if they tested positive for quarantine. And at that point, they had to leave their animals. They had to leave animals that were pets, and they started to really lose their shit about it, because they were like, well, who's going to take care of them? What do we do? I really love these animals. This is part of, these animals are part of my family. There's no legal protection. Oh my God, what is happening? So these animals in the beginning of the pandemic had one issue, are now getting a little bit more protection. And then, like I said, there were 15 dogs and 1 cat that were killed because their owners were positive at a checkpoint when they were traveling with these animals. And Vietnam went absolutely nuts. Social media just went bonkers. So at least for pets, for that sector, I think things changed significantly over that period of time. And I think there was a lot more attention given to that chunk of animals, very small chunk of animals that represents a tiny portion of the ones in the country. As far as zoonosis, nah, I don't think so. I don't think it changed a whole lot at all. I think while the rest of the world wants to boohoo about wet markets, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. That's what all markets are. I mean, this is what, come on, that's what every market in Vietnam is. It's a wet market, which is what Westerners are saying. And it's quite silly. I don't think there's been a whole lot of change about what they think about zoonosis. I really don't. But I do think pets have been elevated. But I think until they make that connection to the other, hundreds of billions of animals and tons of sea life that are killed every year, I think we're kind of missing the point.
Thank you for this answer. And yeah, unfortunately, the pandemic didn't really change a lot of people's mind. Yeah. And I think that was it for questions. Maureen, I will turn this over to you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for this wonderful roundtable. I'm really happy to have seen everyone attending. Thank you to our speakers for their wonderful presentation and for their insightful answers and remarks, for making this discussion really exciting. Thank you, Lou, for the moderation and your very interesting questions. Thank you to our partners for helping us organizing this roundtable, and also for taking an active part in this event today. It was really a pleasure to collaborate with you. Thank you also to the people who watched this event live on YouTube and who will watch the recording. Please share this event around you. It's really an interesting topic, animal legal personhood, to reflect around what the legal status of animals could be. This is, of course, not the only solution, but academics, scholars, practitioners, NGOs, advocates, everyone has to think about how we could change the legal status and treatment of animals in society. This is a big discussion that we have to have and something that we have to work on. So sharing it around you, and please be in touch with us if you're interested to collaborate. Visit also our partners' website, because they're doing an amazing job every day, and they're also organizing events and sharing blog posts and a lot also on their Instagram and LinkedIn accounts. So you can follow them and follow us. And we are also organizing a symposium in September on animals in wars and disasters. And we have extended the deadline to submit abstracts. So if you're interested in presenting an abstract, you can see the form that Rebecca has just shared in the Zoom and YouTube chat. And you can also share this in your network if you know people who could be interested in contributing and presenting at the symposium. It will be held in English and Spanish. So if you speak any of these languages, you're welcome to present your research. And we cover a broad range of topics and disciplines. So you're welcome to attend again in September. And in the meantime, take care, and thank you again for being with us today.